everyone. My name is Michelle Fong. I work in UNHCR and I am part of the policy and advocacy team. My area of focus is child protection and gender-based violence. You would have seen my colleague Joshua Tay, who's also on the call today. Both of us work very closely together on overseeing child protection and gender-based violence programming. We also work very closely with the community-based protection unit. So I think a lot of you have very close collaboration with my colleagues in that unit. Apart from that, you also recognize, you probably know that a lot of the work that we do in child protection and gender-based violence cuts across other areas in UNHCR and some of the work that we do with partners. And I'll kind of, talk a little bit about it through this workshop, through this webinar today. I also recognize that it is quite a short time that we have together, but so maybe treat this webinar really as an overview. I'll kind of walk you through the objectives of the webinar today. And really many thanks for those of you who have made time to join us today. We will make an allowance of around 30 minutes. It's just an extra 30 minutes for you to ask questions. We're happy to take that maybe after the initial webinar. We're also happy to hear, feedback. We recognize that given how short the time is, maybe just based on your feedback and your suggestions, we could also look at organizing another webinar on a more specific thematic area. But for the sake of today's webinar, what we will do is look at why we're doing this session. Okay, so maybe just for your own info, and you'll probably see this on the Refugee Malaysia website or other reports that we generate, is that we currently have over 190,000 asylum seekers and refugees registered with UNHCR. We know that there's probably many more, but that they've had a lot of difficulty accessing UNHCR for registration purposes. But this is the current number that we have, given the kind of capacity that UNHCR also has in the country. And of that total, approximately 23 to 24% of that are children. So 53,000 are persons under the age of 18. And of that percentage, quite a number of them obviously experience unique protection risks, and we'll kind of look at that together. And then maybe just for the sake of our short time together, I'm just going to outline maybe the objectives of today's session. I know that the area of child protection is broad, and there's many different issues under child protection. We won't be able to address all of them today, but for the sake of today's discussion, I think we will look at specifically UNHCR's approach to child protection. Just to give you insight, like how we address child protection, or what is our strategy around addressing child protection, how to recognize common child protection concerns. So what is your role, for example, as community workers or community leaders or community representatives, or even NGO workers? What is the role of NGO workers and UNHCR in responding to someone who has disclosed child protection issues? Okay. All right, I'll just take a pause and see if everyone has no issues hearing me. If you can hear me, just put a thumbs up. There's a react button, and you can click either thumbs up or like another. Excellent, thank you so much for that response. Okay, so there are people coming in still, and it's okay. For those of you who've just joined us, thank you again for making the time. We're going to walk through some of the sort of basics around child protection, and I'm just going to illustrate some of what we might cover and expand on in this session through this video. Okay, just hang on. And hopefully you can hear it. Someone just tell me if you can hear it. Okay, so sorry, I didn't mean to end the video so abruptly. Um, yeah. So have you seen that video before? And if you haven't, that's great. But if you have seen this video before, you would have, I think you'll see some of the elements that we will cover today sort of unpacked a little bit more. Now, even through the video, you would have seen that what we think is important in terms of addressing child protection is we look at strengthening families, working together with communities. There are some work that we have to do with other actors in society. And also, I mean, most importantly as well is that, for example, in the story of Samira herself plays an important role in not just protecting herself, but in protecting, for example, her younger siblings. And so, when you consider the ecological model, which is essentially what you're looking at right here, is that when we do child protection, we're not only thinking about protecting this particular child through response services, we're also looking at, some of the training that we think is important for us to deliver to, refugee communities, families, work in partnership with communities. But also equally important is working with other actors, including civil society organizations. This could be NGOs, service providers, and also government, right? Including donor agencies, in fact. So yeah, I'll kind of unpack that a little bit more as we go along, but just keep that in mind. Keep in mind that when we're talking about child protection, we're not only talking about children who are affected, we are also talking about children who are at risk of, protection issues, and who we should work together with to strengthen and safeguard the child's living situation. Okay. All right, so we're now going to look at UNHCR's approach to child protection, and maybe just broadly speaking is this is in response to maybe questions around, hey UNHCR, there are other people who are doing child protection work, but what is your approach, or what does UNHCR mean by child protection? Sometimes your work is not very clear. So what I'm going to look at is maybe just define what we mean by child protection. Okay, so to UNHCR, to us is that, refugee children or children affected by forced displacement face a very unique sort of, they face unique protection risks. So unlike migrant children, host community children, refugee children face very, very specific and unique kind of risks given their status. And so some of the child protection issues that we often look at would be how we can prevent, mitigate the risks of, and respond to abuse, neglect, exploitation, violence, and separation of children. So we know that during situations of forced displacement, there are unaccompanied and separated children. We also know that even for children who are with families, they also face risks. And so what we do try to promote is look at what is in the best interest of children. Okay, oftentimes is that, I mean, especially for people who are maybe not would necessarily working in the child protection sector, is that they were like, oh, this is a refugee child. This child needs case management or needs direct services. And that may not necessarily be the case. And so we kind of will, I mean, this may require a completely different webinar, but when we look at the child's best interest, we also look at, okay, from a child's rights perspective, is that, ultimately children should be cared for and live in the safety of their parents ultimately, right? So parents are ultimately responsible for caring for their children, but maybe beyond that framework is looking at, who is responsible for children who are facing child protection issues. And actually the primary responsibility is the state, it's the government in which this child is currently either residing in or is located. Now, of course, in the context of Malaysia, Malaysia has not ratified the Refugee Convention, and therefore, refugees, for example, live in a relatively gray area, and sometimes, application of child protection sort of laws are in line with the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and then sometimes it's not. And that inconsistency obviously creates security issues. It creates hesitation or the reluctance from refugee communities to access services or seek out assistance. And sometimes that response, even when given to refugees, it's not, it doesn't meet the minimum standards, as in it's not of high quality, it's not adequate, and sometimes makes their situation worse. Sorry, and then maybe just to highlight that document on the right here is UNHCR's Child Protection Policy. It just came out early this year. So for those of you who may be interested to know more about UNHCR's Child Protection Policy, today what we'll be covering is really a short summary of what that policy talks about, which is what is UNHCR's priorities and what is UNHCR going to do about child protection with other actors. Okay, but if you want to have a sort of a read about that policy, it's available online. You just have to Google UNHCR's Child Protection Policy. It's public, it's available, and you can have a look at that. Okay, now I'm going to also look at what the policy states about UNHCR's priorities, and it's mandatory across all operations, including Malaysia, about our sort of focus. We must look at these many areas, and I'll walk you through them right now. Okay, so you'll see here, it's essentially just to highlight the fact that when we work on addressing child protection issues, it's not just about services. We're looking at really many layers of child protection. And the very first and maybe the top priority is to strengthen inclusive child protection systems. And like I mentioned earlier, is that because in most situations, the primary responsibility rests with the state, the government of the country. It is important, that UNHCR as well as other child protection actors advocate, dialogue, urge the government to consider that refugee children, for example, face unique plights and they need specific sort of considerations and safeguards, they face specific barriers in accessing services. So, one good example is that due to the language barrier, also the fact that access to information, access to digital sort of solutions are not necessarily available to refugees. It's very difficult for refugee children to access the national system. And on top of that, it's also it's daunting. There's quite a lot of procedures, and that information is not quite clear as well. So a lot of what we have to do with other actors, including UNICEF and other child protection actors, is to help the government understand that, hey, while you may not have ratified the UN Refugee Convention, you are still a signatory of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And that means that, and also actually it's good that the Malaysian Child Act doesn't discriminate. It doesn't say that only Malaysian children can be protected. It doesn't define that. It says all children, and therefore we use that to kind of dialogue with the government, help them understand that they cannot practice discriminatory sort of practices. And this is an ongoing effort, right? So like in the video you just saw earlier, is that child protection work takes time. Changing minds, changing attitudes also takes time, but we have seen some progress, we have seen some positive change, and we just have to persist and soldier on. Okay. Maybe the second one you'll see here is supporting children, families, and communities to protect children. So like I mentioned, and you probably, sorry, one second. And you probably would have seen, for those of you who work closely with UNHCR and work with some of our NGO partners, is that we have been increasing maybe the number of programs to protect children, not just raise awareness on child protection issues, but we also work with teachers, we work with parents. So there are some groups that have benefited from positive parenting programs, and we are still developing some of these programs as we go along also to strengthen the capacity of families. We ultimately recognize that children are best with their families, they feel happiest also with their families, and so if there is family tension, we're trying to find ways to promote healthy coping skills in families and within the community as well. So you'll see this kind of well translated into other sectors. So like, for example, some of you may have participated in mental health and psychosocial support training, because we know that, families experience a lot of stress, not just being in a situation of forced displacement, being in a, country that is not yours. There's a lot of stress that affects maybe how they love and how they care for their family members. And so we see that there's a lot of value in designing and creating programs that not just focuses on protecting children, but strengthening the capacities of families. Okay, and then the next one is number 3, which is, it says when needed, because there are some contexts where the government is a bit more open or have refugee protection policies. But in Malaysia, that's obviously not the case, right? So therefore, it is one of our priorities as well to provide supplementary child protection services. And what is that, Michelle? What is supplementary child protection services? It is essentially, when we have a child at risk who requires, protection services or specific specialized services, and this could be psychosocial support services, it could be protection services or interventions, it could be legal support. That's something that we must look at ensuring that children have access to. This is something that is an ongoing. We've been doing this for many years, and obviously it's been an uphill kind of journey, where we're trying to increase the access and availability of services to children at risk. So right now, you may have heard of partners like Host International, Suka Society, El Shaddai, depending on where you're located, even Cahaya Surya Bhakti in Johor, Malaysian Relief Agency. Some of them provide child protection services, meaning if you identify a child at risk or a children who is experiencing violence now, who may not feel safe to approach maybe the police or the hospital, these partners can offer advice or, potentially even carry out an assessment, support you and the community, for example, on deciding what are some options available for them. And this is something that we have never had for, even 5 years before this, we didn't have as many partners, but we do now. We have more partners. Of course, it's still we're not even at a 100% rate where all children can still access services, but we're trying to increase that number or that percentage of access as years go by. Okay, now the next one is strengthen child-friendly protection and solutions. Okay, and what does that mean? It's very similar. It's sometimes what we're trying to do is that when children go through a specific protection procedures, and obviously for those of you maybe who have attended some of the other thematic webinars, is that for someone who is a refugee, they go through a refugee protection case management process, which is, refugees have to go through registration. Some of them go through refugee status determination. Sometimes they go through resettlement procedures. They come to our office. Sometimes they receive services outside of UNHCR. And what we are trying to do is ensure that when some of these services are provided, it is as child-friendly as possible. Meaning, if a registration officer were to speak to a child in a registration interview, they should exercise considerations of how this child would process questions. Does the child feel safe to disclose certain issues? Is the interview too intimidating? Those are considerations that we must enhance. These are things that are important to us. So you may have seen that, or at least only recently, is that when children go through, any of UNHCR's procedures, and if they are children, there are some toys, there are some sort of tools that interviewers or UNHCR staff should use to encourage the child to feel safe to talk about their situation of forced displacement, how they came here, how they're living here, and all that. And apart from that, we also must explain it in a way that, it's not too regimented or mechanical. They have to try and simplify the language so that the child feels also more, the child will be able to understand what they're going through. Why should I share this information with UNHCR? What would UNHCR do with the information I tell them? It's really quite critical for us to consider that, I mean, sometimes we think that children, they're children. They're not gonna worry or ask me anything. But that's not true, right? We know that for a fact that a lot of children have the maturity and the capacity to understand that certain information shouldn't be shared, and it's important for us to try and explain it to them in a way that they understand. Okay, and I mean this is also an area that requires us to collaborate with children and youth groups as well as families, and how we enhance this experience for them. It is not an easy process, I mean, processing refugee claims, there are a lot of questions. There are also very specific terminologies that is not easy for children, but, we also see this as a work in progress. It's important that we continue to prioritize and enhance the quality of our refugee case processing procedures. Okay, next is looking at promoting children's safety and prevent harm through sectoral responses. So it's very similar to the one that I mentioned on the number 2, which is to support children, families, and communities to protect children. But it's beyond just the children, families, and communities. It's also looking at service provision. So, for example, if there are health services provided in a clinic outside by a partner or an NGO, we need to ensure that when health services are being provided, they also consider child protection risks. Like if there's sometimes clinics or health providers or even like food aid delivery, sexual reproductive health services, schools, these are the first point of contact for a lot of children who are experiencing violence. And so what we are trying to do is ensure that child protection sort of considerations like this webinar that you're going through today, is that they recognize what are the signs of it. If that there are children who do report feeling unsafe and they need services that everyone knows what to do in that scenario. It's important that it's not just a child protection actor that is responsible for responding. It is everybody's responsibility. Like the video you saw earlier of Samira, it takes not just Samira herself, but her family, her community, and people in the society to support and protect her. And so so that's kind of something that we also consider. And for those of you who work with some of our health partners or education partners, you would probably hear this a lot more of late, is that there is really a lot of, it's critical, right, that everybody knows what to do if child protection issues come up, similar to gender-based violence, because these are sometimes the only opportunity they have to share that information, and time is limited. Right, so sometimes maybe even a negative experience in that situation, if that disclosure or what they're telling you right now is not handled carefully, it also can break trust. So meaning that person may not feel comfortable to share that information in future or seek out assistance. All right, finally, we look at strengthened child participation and child-friendly communication. Now, this is something I have to admit that UNHCR doesn't do very well, but we are trying a lot of different things. So I think you would have seen from our community-based protection colleagues around increasing child and youth participation, because we know that the views of children, the realities that children and youth face in situations of forced displacement is also unique. And they also require support. So how do we ensure that they have access to spaces where they can share what they're experiencing themselves, and what kind of support we can provide them? How can we, UNHCR, for example, also engage children in other very important services like mental health support and health and education? Okay, so we're going to move on to the next slide, which is how do we recognize a child at risk? Now, we're going to look at what does it even mean? What does a child at risk actually mean? And when we talk about a child at risk, we're looking at quite a few elements. Actually, maybe before I move on, are you all still there? Can you just give me a thumbs up if you're okay? You can hear me? All good? Okay, I see Josh. Great. Awesome. All right, thank you so much for that feedback. It's good to know. And sometimes I can talk very quickly, but just bear with me. I'll try to be mindful about my speed. Okay, so when we talk about child at risk, we're looking at, okay, what are the risks we're talking about, yeah? is a risk is the likelihood of harm happening to this child. So and when we look at the likelihood, we look at a few elements as well. If we look at, okay, what is the likelihood of these child protection issues happening? What are some of the vulnerabilities the person has to probably increase the likelihood of that harm happening? But we also have to recognize that there are also sometimes children have strengths. And we'll look at some examples of those strengths that would enhance their care and support system here in Malaysia. Okay, well, right now we'll look at some of the risk factors. What would increase the likelihood of harm, and some examples we have observed even after many years of doing child protection work. Okay, so I think maybe some easy examples. I think many of you would know is that physical abuse is a common form of child protection, and some examples of physical abuse could be physical acts of violence. It could be hitting, shaking, burning. I used to do child protection case management, so almost like social work, and I used to hear how children talked about incidences happening at home because their parents are really stressed out, for example, or sometimes it is really tantamount to abuse or torture. So when they're being burned with cigarette butts, for example, or like using a hanger, a wire hanger, these are examples of physical abuse. Next is emotional abuse. So sometimes this is not so visible, right? So this one is very visible because it usually is accompanied by physical signs like bruising, marks, injury, yeah. And sometimes it requires even medical attention, right? It could be cuts, deep cuts, like I said, burn marks, for example, that could result in inflammation, and stuff like that. But for emotional abuse, it's usually less visible. You cannot really see signs easily. And a form of emotional abuse would be humiliating them, using language that makes them feel small, and it really disempowers a child. It makes them really question their value in either in a family or in society. So it's insulting. It could be very, very strong criticism, shaming. And we're talking about like often, sometimes, when parents do this maybe once or twice, they may not think it's damaging, but when you speak to children, we recognize that sometimes they have very long-term sort of effects on children, and I think their relationship, for example, with parents or parental figures in their community is really important. They see their own value in how people treat them, and so these are some of the things that we also look at addressing in some of the positive parenting programs that we are trying to run with partners. Okay, there's also sexual abuse. So I think for those of you who participated in the or will participate in the gender-based violence webinar, we will look at maybe more examples of sexual abuse and sexual violence. But some of these examples are here, which is rape. How do I stop the? Oh, here we go. Yeah, so some examples would be sexual exploitation, inappropriate touching, so meaning the child doesn't want to be touched, obviously, in like private areas, showing children inappropriate or pornographic material is also a form of sexual violence. Sometimes even telling them about sexual violence can be a form of sexual abuse. So yeah, these are some common examples. There's also neglect. So when a caregiver or a parent, for example, fails to protect their child, and then sometimes it's intentional. So for example, when child protection concerns are made known to parents, but they don't act on it, or they don't try to minimize the effects of that situation. So for example, not providing enough food or failing to provide supervision. So when children are left alone at home, for long durations of time without food and water or even other support, or for example for children who has maybe disability or developmental issues who require actually more parental or adult supervision, but they are left alone, and sometimes they're not cared for or cleaned, and I understand that sometimes it's very difficult to be able to support children who have developmental issues, but we believe there are support available, and I think that's what we're trying to do is that it's important for the community also to help families like this or parents who could be neglectful to recognize how it could be damaging to children. Okay, there also is exploitation. There are increasing numbers of children who are experiencing exploitation in our context. We know for the longest time, a lot of children travel here on their own to work, and we see that as oftentimes exploitative. So when we use children, for example, for an advantage, so we want them to work so that we can, earn money from them. There are situations where the family, for example, sends their child here to work at a very, very young age, and then they have to send money back. And there's also children who are forced to work in really dangerous situations. I had an example of a child who was working in a factory to sort of cut wood with a heavy machinery, and he accidentally cut his hand off. It's not even, it's sort of the risks or the security and safety issues that they face, or the risk that they face when they are working at such a young age, it presents themselves also with child protection risks. So there are also situations, there was a case, I think maybe 2 years ago during COVID when, there were children, for example, they were working in a mask making factory, and they were working for very, very long hours, very, very low wage, and sometimes they also reported of experiencing abuse. These are examples of exploitation. Okay, the other example is unaccompanied children. So we know that during situations of forced displacement, when there's political or security instability in your country of origin or in countries of transit, so before they come to Malaysia, some families can be separated. It happens also here. So even when families arrive safely together, maybe it's during a police or immigration raid that the child becomes separated from their parents. And so an unaccompanied child is someone who is separated from both parents or other relatives. Oftentimes it's blood-related relatives, and they don't have enough, they don't have enough care. They don't have anyone to support them and look after them or ensure that they are safe. We have quite a number of unaccompanied children in the country. Child-headed households, it would be, children who essentially take care of themselves. So if we have a situation where the oldest person in that house or in that room or in that care situation is a child themselves, that is a child-headed household. We have seen this quite a lot in certain groups of ethnic groups where groups of children work together and they stay together, and so these are also child household. And why is child household a problem? Well, because there are also risks to that. Without adult supervision, they may not be able to. There are safety issues also with how they, for example, manage fires, or there are also other risks. For example, how they respond to even safety issues at home because of the power difference, right? So if, let's say, there is another adult that maybe comes every now and then, there could also be exploitative risks. And child marriage. So for girls, for example, we see this in our context a lot, is that a lot of girls marry early. Sometimes it's not even what they want, it's what their family wants. And they may not even fully understand what they're going through. They could be sold into this marriage. They feel that they're just trying to honor their parents' wishes. I know that also, of course, poverty drives child marriage. So for families that cannot afford to, feed their own family, feed all their family members because of, it's difficult to find work and money. Sometimes they resort to marrying their daughters off early. And obviously this deprives children of accessing education, other services. They themselves are not fit and capable of childbearing. There are health risks associated with that. I think a lot of you are familiar with the issue as well. Yeah, and we have children who are also associated with armed forces, and this could happen in their country of origin. So children who, for example, who've experienced child recruitment, who were part of, like, for example, the military forces or armed forces, they themselves even would have experienced, obviously, quite a lot of trauma from, the recruitment, being taken away from their families, also themselves having forced to commit violent acts. They also experience child protection concerns, and they need support as well. Okay, so we've talked about, so let me just go back essentially what we were talking about in the first place, which is, what increases the likelihood of more harm or harm, right? Is that we've just talked about some examples of child protection concerns, but we will now look at vulnerabilities, okay? So some examples of vulnerabilities would be, for example, the lack of consistent and responsive caregivers. So like I mentioned before, is that a lot of what we're trying to do is to reduce risks, reduce the vulnerability where possible, is through supporting caregivers. So we help them recognize that, your child actually wants to talk to you, your child wants to spend time with you. And sometimes parents, at least from some of our work in positive parenting, is that they don't know how to show that they care about their child. And so what we're trying to do is enhance that caregiving sort of a relationship between a caregiver and a child. Like I mentioned, there's also birth abnormalities or developmental challenges. So if a child, for example, has impairments, like they cannot verbally say that they are in trouble or they need help, or it creates more risks for them, right? Now, unmet basic needs, so if they don't have enough food, they don't even have stable accommodation or housing, maybe, they're constantly being evicted, that creates risks as well. Family separation, so the exposure to violence, so prior exposure to violence also puts them at risk. Lack or loss of access to education. So when, for example, if you're in school, there's someone, an adult, usually like a teacher or other staff or children in your surrounding that can obviously give you information, keep an eye on you, can assist you sometimes in situations of emergency. But if you're not in an education setting, if you're not in school and you don't have access to that kind of support, of course, it creates more risks for you. Also harmful social and gender norms. So, we consider, early marriage, for example, as a harmful traditional practice. I know that this is not well received in many communities. Not a lot of communities believe that child marriage is also part of their culture, but there are some that still thinks that, oh, it's the best thing for our children. We want them to be married early so that, they can have healthier babies. Obviously, that's not necessarily the case for us. But yeah, harmful social and gender norms are also, it can create risks, especially for girls, child marriage and stuff like that. Okay, so we've looked at child protection concerns, and you'll see that how vulnerabilities can increase the likelihood of violence, right, for children. We can all agree on that. So oftentimes we get referrals about, hey, UNHCR or hey, NGO partner, we have a child who is, for example, unaccompanied, and they are also, not in school. So you can see how that increases their risk, right? Or if the child is married and her partner is abusive and she has no contact with her community or her friends or her anybody in the community, that creates the likelihood of harm, increases the likelihood of harm. Okay, but right now we're going to look at protective factors, because of course what we're trying to do when we do programming on child protection is increase those risks, increase care and support for children, so that even if they face these risks, we can try and reduce the risk of further harm. Okay, are we all good? All right. So what we're going to do now is, oops, sorry. Thank you so much for the feedback. All right, so now we're going to look at protective factors. Okay, how can we together look at strengthening protective factors? So obviously a lot of the protective factors is almost like the opposite of vulnerabilities, right? We want to be able to enhance caregivers' capacity. We also want, for example, for children to have meaningful connections with others. So children generally who have experienced violence, if they don't feel safe, they would isolate themselves. They may not share what they have gone through because they don't know whether you will actually help me or harm me even more. So we're trying to enhance the capacity of that child to have more meaningful or rebuild trust again, right? And this other person doesn't necessarily have to be their parent, especially if the parents were abusive themselves. It's also to be able to form trust and meaningful relationships with others in their community. We also want to be able to ensure that children have access to basic needs, right? So this is in line with the just basic child rights, access to education. We also want to promote self-esteem because we know that if children have a healthy self-esteem, if they are empowered, and oftentimes when children feel safe around others, they also feel more empowered to not just talk about issues that are important to them, but be able to contribute to their community as well. So in terms of leadership, also design solutions for their community with other actors like UNHCR. Okay, and then we also want to be able to increase access to community programs. So one example is there are some programs on child protection, child rights awareness. There are also some youth camps, some youth programs. And when we increase that access for children, I think it also increases their likelihood of forming friendships. And friendships obviously have a protective value. It helps them also feel a sense of belonging, that they are not all by themselves and that they have other people they can turn to for help. And that's what we are trying to increase. And obviously, this is what we are here for today, is to increase the just awareness on that there are help out there. You're not all on your own, and it's not completely helpless. There are some services out there that you can look for, seek out, and just learn more about, even if they don't need it now. Just the knowledge of there are some support services available is also in itself protective. Okay, so optimism and hope, of course, you see that value. All right, so we'll kind of walk through maybe an example, just almost like to practice what we have just learned in terms of risk. We were going back to the same question about, hey, Michelle, when do I know if a child is at risk, right? So most of the time, a child at risk is when these two elements on the top is heavier than the elements at the bottom, right? So when the risk factors on the top is heavier than the protective factors at the bottom. What we're trying to do is create more protective factors so that the risks at the top is lesser, right? Okay, let's look at this example now. Now, is Lisa a child at risk? And I will describe that Lisa is a 16-year-old girl. She arrived in maybe Malaysia 1 year ago. She works part-time in a hair salon, and so she washes, and cleans the hair salon. And she also washes dishes in a nearby restaurant. So she works a few days in the hair salon and a few days in the restaurant. And she stays with her villagers. So from this information alone, I'm not giving you all the information, right? But what you have here is potentially an unaccompanied child, because it sounds like she stays with her villagers and not her parents, right? It also sounds like she's working, so we really don't know enough about her working conditions, whether, her employer could be abusive towards her, they could be using emotional abuse, we don't know. We also don't know what kind of, for example, in a hair salon, sometimes you use, what's the word, like irons and like electrical appliances, and we don't know how dangerous that is for her, whether she even understands the language to understand the instructions that she's given. We also don't know who else she works with, right? Whether she feels safe working and where she's working. So, so I think maybe we can come to the conclusion that there's not enough information actually, Michelle. We don't know whether really Lisa is a child at risk. For all you know, maybe there are other, maybe her employer is good to her. For all you know, maybe the work that she has is to ensure that she can also pay her rent. Maybe her villagers are actually very supportive and caring towards her, and they keep an eye on her. So we really don't know, right? And so it just helps. I mean, I hope this helps essentially illustrate that when we look at a child at risk, we have to consider what are some of the risk factors at the top, and what are some of the protective factors that may not make this case essentially, it helps us decide what the urgency level. Okay, so like I mentioned, this is just to illustrate what we are considering in terms of like what is urgent, what is an emergency, what is maybe a case that may not even require specialized services, right? And what we're looking at is that oftentimes threats, as in risk factors, are threats to safety, threats to that person's well-being. Social stigma. So, for example, if after what this child has gone through, for example, sexual violence, or if they identify to be part of the, you know, as a LGBTIQ plus person, there could be discrimination. They could be, you know, excluded from the community, or maybe there's just very limited access to services. There's just no services available, or even if they are, it's very difficult to get that access. That creates risk factors. But you'll see here we're trying to increase protective factors. So if there are the child, for example, or the caregivers that they live with have resources, they have information, they know what to do in situations of an emergency, or they have good social connections, maybe they have good relationships with the church, or like, you know, religious leaders, or maybe NGO workers, or community leaders, or other women leaders, for example. Or if themselves, they can read, write, they have capacity, they have skills, they are able to, you know, articulate what they need very clearly. They feel, you know, for example, they have a healthy self-esteem. You know, for example, even their attitudes and their values, you know, has, for example, if the child generally is open and willing to learn and is generally cooperative, for example, that creates, you know, more protective factors for them, generally speaking. So yeah, I mean, I hope that maybe the exercise just gives you some idea. I know that not all cases are as simple as that, and oftentimes it does require sort of a case-to-case analysis. It depends on what kind of case is presented to you, or what's the child's situation that is in front of you. And so what we look at is essentially, this is an emergency level. And when we look at the child's, for example, when we go back to this chart, is that if this is very heavy, right? The more heavy it is on the top, it's obviously higher risk. And often that means is that requires urgent action now. So if the child is experiencing violence, for example, and it's very likely that they're going to go through, you know, abuse, or have experienced abuse before, or if there's serious injury and requires medical attention now, that is oftentimes an emergency. Now, if sometimes the child has experienced harm, but there are some maybe a bit more protective factors. So, for example, an NGO service provider has been supporting them, or this child has maybe family members or relatives that are, you know, willing to support her. That may not require so much response because we know that there's or maybe there is no injury and the child feels, you know, for example, ready to access certain services that are available to them. It becomes more of a medium risk. Now, if a child, for example, is at risk of harm, but the likelihood of that harm happening is more like a potential only if this person shows up, or only if, you know, so basically there is a risk for sure, but even if the incident does happen, there are more protective factors to ensure that even if there is a threat or an actual incident, the harm can be essentially evaded. So I'll give you an example of, maybe this is an unaccompanied child living on their own, unaccompanied child living with villagers, but the villagers care for her or care for them, and the child has also access to school. So even if there are risks, there are quite a lot of protective factors to minimize either the exposure or the likelihood of that harm. Okay, so there's low risk. Now, if it's not at risk of harm, obviously we're talking about the reality that is likely that there's a lot of strengths, but very few sort of protection issues. Okay, so let's talk about a situation where a child comes to you, so I know there's quite a lot of you with different types of roles in your community or even in your day-to-day sort of capacity. But if let's say, and it depends on what you can do in that situation. So if a child comes to you and says, hey, I don't feel safe in my living situation right now. I really want to be able to talk about what I've gone through. Then the big question becomes, okay, what do I do now, right? We have many examples of like when we work with, for example, different sectors like health, education, or even other protection sectors where they don't really know what to do after maybe a child has reported abuse. Now, what you do depends on your role. Okay, so the few examples that maybe we'll discuss today is really, okay, if you're a community helper, like this is your role. If you're an NGO worker, this is your role. And if you're a child protection actor, there are three categories of that. Sorry. Now, if you're a community helper, oftentimes if you are not linked to or part of a child protection NGO, or your day-to-day responsibility does not include child protection responsibilities. So that's what I mean by no CP functions, no child protection functions. Your role is not to provide child protection services. Then your role is actually to link that child to appropriate services. So your role is to make sure that a child who is disclosed, for example, abuse or is experiencing threats of harm or harm can access someone who can help them, and it's often here and here. So linking children from here to here, okay? And then similarly, there are people who may be NGO workers. So let's talk about like health partners, or maybe you're a community health worker, or if you work in a clinic, or if you work as a teacher, for example. So maybe you're part of an NGO, but you actually don't have a child protection function. So it's not like you are a community child protection like caseworker, for example. You're not. So you don't have a child protection function, and your role is still to ensure that children who disclose incidences of abuses to you, let's say you're a teacher, that your role as a teacher is to make sure that they have access to child protection services, because this requires specialized skills and specialized procedures, right? Now, I'll give you an example. So if let's say you're a teacher and maybe today the child has disclosed that I'm being abused at home, right? Then your role is to, I'll share with you shortly, is to link them to appropriate services. Your role is not to go in and investigate, not to call in the parents and ask them like, hey, your child has reported abuse. That's not your role, because your role is to make sure that the child, so we're trying to ensure that the child's safety is top priority. We really don't know how the parents will react to, for example, when you speak to them about the abuse, because that could increase, in fact, more abuse at home, right? Or sometimes they leave and not come back to your school. So we want to make sure that when a child discloses, has bravely come out and explained that this is the safety issues that they're experiencing, that they are linked to appropriate services, so that they can figure out the safest way to one, protect the child, and maybe reconcile, mediate, and ensure that the child can go back to their family safely. Okay, and then so like I mentioned, child protection partners. So we have a list of those partners on the UNHCR Malaysia website. Is that they provide specialized child protection services. So their work is to work with children, talk to them about what they have gone through, make sure that they have services including psychosocial support. Sometimes if shelter is needed, then we need to look at shelter. Sometimes you don't need shelter. Sometimes they just want someone to talk to about what they've gone through. Sometimes they also need access to medical assistance. So if there's injury or if they need even legal support, those are some of the things that the child protection actor, the child protection service provider, is supposed to explore and walk that child through that process. So and that is also a participatory approach. So the child understands what they're going through and understands the consequences of what they've reported. And yeah, so it's a journey of it's a recovery and rehabilitative journey. Okay, and so like I mentioned, sometimes child protection service providers don't offer, I mean, sometimes they don't offer everything. You know, they themselves don't have a counseling background, maybe, or they don't have a legal background. So what they do is that they work with other actors that have that expertise, and they have to coordinate and make sure that the services they provide is done in a way that is holistic, comprehensive, and obviously the aim is to make sure that this child can, like I said, increase their protective factors, right? And reduce the risk factors. That's really the aim that we're looking for. Okay, so like I mentioned, when we look at these three roles, a lot of it is support linking to appropriate services. Now when the child has already disclosed a child protection issue, they feel very unsafe and they want someone to help them. What is your role? Your role and how do we support them properly is to look at these three L's: look, listen, and link. Now, for those of you who've heard this many, many times before, so treat this as a refresher. But for those of you who maybe are not so familiar, is I don't know how to support her or him or her, a child, for example, in a child-friendly way. Just recognize that you don't always have to do something right now. It's important for you to just listen, look, listen, and link. Okay. So Michelle, what do you mean by look? Okay, so we look at so essentially when a child talks to you about what they are going through is to try and be at the same level with them. So you can see here that the child is sitting down and both the teachers, these two adults are sitting with her, you know, and recognizing that the child has, you know, mustered up the courage. You know, it must have been very difficult to come and tell somebody about what they've gone through. So it's important for you to pay attention, look at them, and help them recognize that they are important. Whatever that they're telling you is important to them. It's serious, and don't, you know, as much as possible, don't say like, oh, you know, you're just making it up. I don't have the time for this, you know, and sort of disregard what they're saying. It's important for you to look at them, and give them your fullest attention, because, you know, obviously it's not easy for them. And sometimes they don't even have the right words to say, so it's important to be patient. Okay, so look at them, help them feel safe, maintain an open body language. So sometimes, you know, you would cross your arms because, you know, you maybe that's just a habit, that's just the way you stand. But it's important to try and keep an open body language so that they know that it's safe, they don't feel like they're being judged, okay? And just ask them whether it's even the right place to talk. So sometimes maybe the child walks up to you in a classroom, or maybe in the waiting area in the clinic, or just somewhere in a community space, but other people can hear you. So maybe it's not the best place to talk about it. Sometimes the child has a different gender from you. So the child could be a girl, but you're a male teacher. Sometimes you can ask them, okay, do you feel, do you feel safe talking to me about it, or would you prefer talking to someone, you know, like a female teacher? And you can give them a name, you know, teacher Lisa, you know, and she can also talk to you about it. So ask them what do they prefer, just to make it as comfortable as possible for them. Second is to listen. So like I mentioned, it's also to pay attention. Sometimes you can also tell them like, I am listening, I'm here, you know, thank you for telling me what you're going through. I would like to hear more, you know. Be patient, like I said, don't react. So sometimes, you know, when you react saying like, I can't believe this has happened to you, it can be quite scary for children. Sometimes they're not sure how to process what they're going through. So maybe try not to react, because if you react too strongly, sometimes children will feel like they would feel a regret or guilt about sharing what they have gone through, right? So try to stay calm and just validate and affirm that that you are listening and what they're doing is the right thing. Okay, and help them, also let them express themselves. Don't try and, you know, sort of tell them how they should feel, like, oh, you know, they don't change their story. Let them tell you the story. Like I mentioned before, don't interview or try to investigate. It is ideal that this kind of interview or probing, getting more information, trying to get exact details about, for example, sexual assault, that's not your responsibility. You say like, you know, thank you for telling me what you have gone through. It sounds very serious. right? And then we look at the linking part. How do we connect this child now with somebody who can support them in an appropriate way? And so when we talk about linking, we ask, we also ask if they have someone they can trust. So it may not even be us, right? Or may not even be an NGO. Sometimes they say like, I've gone through this, and we ask them if they feel safe by asking, do you have anybody you can trust at home? Sometimes they say, oh, my mother, or sometimes my older sister, or my villager, or my pastor, for example. And that helps them recognize what are the other protective factors they could have if you cannot help them or stuff like that. Now, stay with the child until they feel safe. So if they report violence, right? They feel unsafe right now, and they feel unsafe to go home, or they are experiencing, bullying, for example. It's important that you stay with them until until you can connect them with somebody else who can continue to support them. Provide them with information on services. It's okay to say sometimes that I don't know. Like, for example, if they ask you like, oh, what can I do about my situation? It's okay to say, I don't know now, but I will go and find out, or I will talk to someone who knows. And please don't try to solve their situation. Like I said, don't contact someone they have reported against. We really don't encourage that, because oftentimes it makes it worse. Now, don't force children to go back with their caregivers if they don't want to, especially if they told you that they feel unsafe, they've been abused, or that's really, it changes maybe their relationship with you. They would feel that they cannot trust you with what they've just told you. Now, so what should I say, right? So like I mentioned before, when the child has maybe told you everything they've gone through and they've expressed that they want help, is you can tell them that, thank you for telling me about your situation. It must be very difficult. I'm sorry that you have gone through that. I don't think that's something that should happen to you. But then share that if you want to talk more about what you're going through, or if you want, I can connect you with someone who can support you through this situation. It sounds like you need more help. It sounds like you need more support, right? And then what you do is that you can say, I know that UNHCR works with a few NGO partners, and this is where you can either seek help from them. So, and usually what will happen is, because they're children, depending on their age and maturity, sometimes if they're a bit older and they want to do it themselves, that's okay too. But if they want your help to be connected, it's important that you help either contacting that NGO partner, telling them a little bit about what they have told you, and of course with their permission, and share a little bit about, I know somebody. So when you call the NGO partner, you can say that, for example, you're from this school or from this community, and I know that there is a child right now who may need help. They have just told me about this incident, and they feel unsafe about going home, and they want to talk to somebody about what they are going through. These are just some examples. Sorry, I'm just also trying to look at the time and make sure that we cover as much as possible. But yeah, I mean, I'm happy to expand this a bit more. I know that, for example, this webinar this recording of the webinar will be made available online, so you can always go back and listen to it. I can also make these slides available physically if you ever need to look at it again. So yeah, but just so you know, I guess the more you do this, the more practice that you go through of supporting the child and sharing that you may not be the answer. You don't have to be the one solving their issue, and just making sure that you pass them along to someone who is responsible to do that, or will do that, is the biggest help already. Okay. Okay, so now what happens next? So let's say the child say, yes, please connect me with somebody who can help me, right? Is that now you have a child at risk, and you've given them information about their services, and they say, yes, I want your help to connect me to those services, right? You can either give them the number based on the Refugee Malaysia website, or if you know somebody who is part of the NGO, right, contact them. You need consent. So if, let's say, they said, no, maybe the child is too young, to be able to call them on their own, or don't have a mobile phone, then you ask them, do you give me permission to share what you've told me today with this NGO partner so that they can get in touch with you and they can, assist you. It's important to get permission because it's part of the trust process. Now, if they've trusted you with this information, they may not want you to share that information with everybody. And so just the process of you telling them, thank you for telling me this, I am going to share a little bit, if you give me permission, I will share a little bit about what we talked about with this NGO partner so that they know that they have control of that information, that you're not just going to share it with anybody. You are going to talk to them about who you're going to share their information with. The last thing we need is for you to share that like gossip, and it's obviously not helpful, or it doesn't protect the child at all. So it's important that you exercise confidentiality, recognize that when you talk to about a child situation with many people who don't need, it can cause more danger for them. So it's important that you recognize that information belongs to them. They trusted you with that information, and you should only share it with people who you know can help them and will help them. Yeah. And obviously call the partner or email them or refer that case along. Okay, so maybe I'll just walk you through a little bit about what we mean by case management. I think I mentioned this already a little earlier, is that depending on the child's situation or what the child has gone through, when we talk about case management, we're talking about a very structured way of assessing what the child has gone through. Usually the child protection assessor or social worker or caseworker would ask them a series of questions so we have a comprehensive understanding of what they're going through. And it's a little bit like the earlier section about looking at, the child's sort of risks and protective factors. Who is in the child's life? How can we design an appropriate case plan for them, right? And then based on what the child tells you, we identify whether the child actually requires case management or whether the child requires shelter or other services accordingly. Yeah, so all that. Now, if you need to know more about who are UNHCR's partners, who do we work with on child protection issues, you can go to the Refugee Malaysia website, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with. And if not, I think we'll put that somewhere in the chat maybe later, is that you'll find a list of partners here, how you can contact them, their operating hours, what kind of languages are available, and where they're located, and what kind of services they provide. And you can see how you can contact them. So like their contact information, you can contact by email. If let's say sometimes you have to attach certain documents, for example, you can also contact them via email. Okay. However, I will just caveat that a lot of our partners that we work with may not necessarily, depending on when it happens and depending on their capacity, sometimes the child requires medical attention right away, right? If you're in a situation where a child is injured and requires medical attention right now, if the child is, for example, a victim of rape, within 72 hours, the child must go straight to the hospital. Okay. So you must do that, and from our understanding is, and from various experiences that we know, is that hospitals can, will accept children who have experienced sexual abuse, requires medical attention right away in most government hospitals. Okay, so in summary, UNHCR works with many stakeholders, so it's not something that UNHCR specifically does alone. It won't be effective if UNHCR did child protection work alone. We must work with different stakeholders, including children, parents, community, other stakeholders that uphold child protection and child rights. Children at risk, for example, face different types of risks, concerns, and they also have protective factors. So we have to weigh that and see accordingly. And then we also looked at maybe just the roles that we play in terms of responding to children. There are some people who are supposed to obviously encourage that they seek out specialized services, and the best way we can do it is to be as child friendly and trauma informed, which is to look, listen, and link. Okay, so That's really a lot of what I've covered today, and I think we don't have a whole lot of time left, and I apologize for taking a lot longer than I expected. But if you'd like to know more about what I've covered today, maybe in a bit more detail, like I mentioned, there is the UNHCR Child Protection Policy. It's available online. We also have UNHCR's best interest procedures. It is really just UNHCR's way of doing child protection case management. So if you'd like to know more about that, I'm happy to organize another session to kind of expand on that a bit more in the future. But that material is also available in public. There's also what we call an interagency standing committee. It's just like essentially a global an agreed way of addressing gender-based violence, and there is a pocket guide. So for example, the Look Listen link is a very helpful tool that you can download. It's available in Burmese, a lot of different languages, Arabic, Somali, Bahasa Malaysia, and you can find that translation online as well. And then similarly for child protection, a lot of what we do, including programs, case management, working with other actors, doing coordination work, for example, we look at trying to enhance minimum standards, making sure that when we do it with as much quality as possible. And if it's not up to that quality, we work towards meeting that quality. Okay, thank you so much. I'm actually going to ask if Hanani could, we're happy to take questions now, actually. So if you have any questions or any reactions, we're happy to take them now. I'm happy to respond to them.